Graffiti. It's one of those words that brings mixed emotions to so many people. For me, it's sheer loathing when confronted with the mindless scribbles and daubs of equally mindless numbskulls who think somehow it's okay to inflict their talentless vandalism on the rest of society. I only have to think of taking a train journey into London or a ride on the New York subway to reinforce my view that these guys, and it is mostly guys, should be hung, drawn and quartered, or de minimis have their right hand chopped off so they can't inflict any more of their tasteless, so-called artwork on the rest of society. Not that it's confined to the likes of London and New York. Beijing also has its fair share, though thankfully not as much as what you'd find in the West. I'm not actually referring to the revolutionary slogans and paintings of Mao Zedong and his ilk in the 1920s and onwards. They used their art in public places to galvanize the masses behind the country's communist revolution. And during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party daubed propaganda in large red characters on factory walls, which ironically enough have almost all been painted over in modern times, save for a few specially preserved slogans in places such as 798 Art District. Graffiti itself has been heavily influenced in Beijing by the urban street art of the West. In fact, at times it's used here purely to highlight a particular business or service to somehow make it stand out. I first became aware of graffiti in Beijing when I had to visit a local hospital called the China-Japan Friendship Hospital. Half of its rear-facing perimeter has a long, nondescript wall which had small but somewhat cute graffiti painted onto it. I quite enjoyed a so-called love tank that faced the rear entrance of the hospital where the international section was located. There's even been a documentary film made about Beijing's graffers by one of the guys who works in my office building. He's obsessed with the subject, or perhaps more with his portrayal of the subject, but that probably says more about him and his ego than the actual art of graffiti. According to him, most Chinese graffers draw their inspiration from American hip-hop culture, preferring to tag their names in English, and they usually come from China's middle classes. Within a couple of months of my discovering this Chinese street art, the walls around the hospital were once again painted over with a turgid grey colour, and it was clear to anyone that though some of the previous artwork had been quite grotesque, it surely had to have been better than this all-pervasive battleship grey. And then, slowly but surely, the pictures started to return. While some could be described as interesting or even nice, there were plenty of pretty ghastly daubs too, just like at most of the world's graffiti sites, I guess. There again, there were some interesting compositions. Not necessarily very nice, but you can tell there's some kind of artistic talent there struggling to break through. Another centre for graffiti in Beijing is in the parking lot of a 3.3 store in Sanlitun, an area given over to boozing foreigners, and a place I try to avoid most of the time. This is where the commercial side of graffiti rears its ugly head, and I do mean ugly. Some of the small numbers of Beijing graffers are even paid to daub the walls of this underground car park, which falls across 2 levels. I can only wonder, why? In 2010, there was actually a pop art festival held in the area, and someone had the bright wheeze of inviting well-known international graffiti artists to paint graffiti live in the parking garage downstairs from the festival, and the artists were allowed to work while being observed by festival patrons. The themes focused on dangerous radiation and environmental protection, and it said that 35 artists contributed to the creation of the biggest graffiti wall ever in Beijing at the time. Some are quite clever, I guess. 1 or 2, out of the 50-plus scrawls, are pretty well done too, such as a motorbike, which reminds me of the one used in Shania Twain's video of I'm Gonna Get You Good. Another artist from Tianjin also hits the right button for me, with his daubed car blending in perfectly to a car parking backdrop. But these two apart, I can honestly say there was very little else of interest, or dare I use instead the T word, talent. Over to the east in the trendy arty-farty 798 district, where once again the lack of artistic talent is very much in evidence, albeit interspersed with a handful of rather nice pieces, they even have a shop devoted to selling cans of spray paint to the kids who obviously have too much money and too little else to occupy their time. I think they're referred to as art students. Graffiti is everywhere in this artistic community. Some appear in the unlikeliest of places, such as a wall in a derelict part of 798, which hardly anyone goes near, while others are brash and in your face, quite well created, but appear as if they are there simply to shock. One artist, Seth, appears to like the slicing up of bodily parts, as can be found in his blue pig, or is it an aardvark, I ask myself. University campuses, too, don't escape their share of the graffiti artists. At Renmin University, one of China's elite Ivy League for instance, there appears to be one wall that has been put aside for students to show off their lack of talent. Nowhere else on campus could I see any, which makes me think that this is an officially sanctioned wall. It's a bit like the special wall that's been erected next to the Great Wall of China at Mutianyu to try to reduce as much as possible the idiots who insist on defacing this historical masterpiece. It's very tame here at Renmin, and dare I say verging on the downright boring. Okay, I dare. If it's real graffiti you want, you probably can't do better, or maybe that should read worse, than walk along Jinmilu, a wall-lined street that runs parallel to the capital airport's express rail line. Nowadays, it is Beijing's most famous spot for graffiti. There has been a long stretch of wall hidden from the main passers-by with trees and shrubs, and also a place where some other socially inept residents go to exercise their ghastly canines, allowing them to poop with impunity. So altogether then, a place you might well want to avoid. It's said that film crews regularly use this wall as a backdrop for whodunits and trendy social dramas. Okay, one might argue, and many do, that the wall itself is pretty awful in its own right, and that a few daubs of paint brighten the place up a bit. I think this is where I will sit on the proverbial fence, as I guess I can see both arguments, both for and against. Some of the works are simply words that could be the graphers' names, or something else equally meaningless in the overall scheme of things, though I have to admit to quite liking some of the colour combinations used. But then, my taste in colours has always been verging on the questionable, I'm told. The most striking work, and probably one of the most famous in Beijing, is of a giant pig with a Chinese chopper stuck in its back. Its body is already sliced into pork chops, but it is smoking a cigar, its red eyes shining angrily. According to a BBC report, it was created by a 25-year-old art graduate who calls himself Scar. It represents the nearest thing one might get to political comment here in China, a commentary on the fluctuating pork prices in the market. There's another pic a bit further along, this time representing what? A lobotomy? Maybe it too has deep political significance, but I haven't found mention of it anywhere yet. When I paid my last visit to this wall, it was just a couple of weeks before the start of some football competition over in Brazil that seemed to be getting some of the locals all uptight. I think it was called the World Cup or something. Perhaps that is why someone had taken it upon themselves to scrawl Germany in black, red and yellow of the national flag. And yet, don't you think that maybe Deutschland would have been somewhat more appropriate? Perhaps they didn't have enough spray paint, or maybe they simply couldn't spell it. The only outright sexist painting I saw of this wall was of a bikini-clad nymphette tugging at her panties for some inexplicable reason. Perhaps one reason that in the main Beijing's graffiti is not as obnoxious as that to be found in the West is that over there most graffiti is done as a spray and run job, whereas here in Beijing the graphers don't seem to be afraid of the long arm of the law, probably because the boys in blue would then have to put down their mugs of tea and get up and do some real work enforcing the law. Heaven forbid. So when I came across a guy who had his paints spread out in a nice little row on the ground, he had 3 female admirers camped out on a large tarpaulin, slicing up pieces of watermelon for him to sustain his energy. It must be tough being a graffiti artist in China, but I guess someone has to do it, don't they?